So, as you can see, there are 4 participants in this panel. Aleš Spetic had a really good keynote, so we invited him as well. And we will see later why we did that. So, we want to talk about hardware, obviously. We all know those names by heart: Oculus, Nest, Jawbone, Pebble. There's a lot of things going on in the hardware world, but we want to talk about why. Why is it? Why now? Why is hardware so hot? What is going on? What happened? We heard some things earlier today, but I would like you guys to tell me your opinion. What is going on? Jeff.
Thank you very much, Mia, and also thank you to the...
Take the mic.
Thank you very much, Mia, and also thank you to the organizers of ICD for inviting us here. On the subject of why hardware is hot now, it's a combination of many things. The first, in my opinion, is that with the prevalence of smartphones, the cost of these really interesting electronic components, accelerometers, cameras, LEDs, lights, has come way, way down, and they're very much more available. On top of that, the availability of entry-level electronics such as the Raspberry Pi has allowed people to really experiment and get out there. People who don't have backgrounds in electronics engineering can buy something off the shelf and hook it up to their Arduino and drag some stuff around the screen and make something happen. And this is new. So 10 years ago you couldn't do that, 20 years ago you couldn't do that, 5 years ago you couldn't do that. And it's really the time for being able to put something together in your garage, prove your concept, and then bring it to market.
Yeah. Aleš, you are doing that. When did you start Cube Sensors? How did you get the idea? Was it harder than it was today? Tell us a bit more.
Well, Cube Sensors is kind of, well, we are kind of old startup. We are 3 years old, I guess. But effectively, we've been working with this for 3 years. In terms of designing stuff, in terms of procuring, sourcing, like the components and all that, it actually was really much the same as today. One of the big differences that we had was that we weren't able to go crowdfunding. Because Kickstarter just started, Indiegogo just started, and they were still preventing from non-US companies or groups of actually selling stuff or getting interest from on their platform. So we had to rely on our own. So for us, for the past 3 years, yes, a lot of things changed. Though in terms, like Jeff said, the big thing about why hardware now is simply because of internet, because the physical world, like the UPSs and the supply chain components, followed up with internet. So for me, it actually is the same or even easier to get things from China or Brazil than it is from the local store, because local store does not have as big warehouse as Amazon or some supplier from Brazil has.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned crowdfunding. There are few projects from Slovenia that were crowdfunded successfully. How did they do that if you cannot crowdfund it? If you can't go on Kickstarter, if you are from Slovenia? Or
well, it's actually a really sad story. In fact, and I believe that's the same from Ukraine. Yeah. You can do it in the past year if you move your company to UK, like we're talking about Kickstarter, or you find someone who has a social security number in US, and basically you pay him or her like 5% of the fees, so that legally it's their project, but you present yourself as the actual theme. So it's a sideways. It's just yet another mediator, broker in between that takes away 5% of your revenue.
Yeah, Yaroslav, do you have something to add? Why now? Why hardware?
First of all, the hardware was always cool. And now it became more easier just because, in my opinion, the access for technologies became much easier, the cost dropped, and for sure, as my colleagues mentioned, the Internet of Things, the hardware things became alive now. You can easily program stuff, you can communicate with the hardware device. They got a soul. and it's rising very extremely, I think.
So hardware is going through some kind of similar revolution software went through a few years ago. Aleksander, can you make some kind of comparison between software and hardware?
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking about what to add to these guys because we pretty much said everything, right? So I have to get creative. I thought I'm going to start and tell about 3D printing and everything, but I didn't get the chance. One of the things that I've thought about why now is, and that might be a little bit provocative, is people just got sick of being virtual. I mean, they actually wanted to have something in their hands. And this is due to the success of the apps, which we see, and there's literally millions, and it's very hard to choose from. And all your life is virtual, you are communicating with your friends virtually. Every now and then you actually want to hold something in your hand. And another reason, I guess, is that there was a guy who was smart enough to realize what happened in the app world is also happening in the hardware world. So if we look back a few years, most of the hardware was multifunctional. Maybe digital cameras is a good example. Now digital cameras can do pretty much everything, not just take a photograph or the smartphones. And they figured out, okay, so apps are very specific. They do something, or only one thing, but they do it very good. So now we see exactly the same thing happening in the hardware world. For example, there's Fitbit, which only has few accelerometers in it. It's very easy in terms of what the hardware is like, but it's doing it very good, so it only has one function. So I guess somebody figured out it has to happen also in the hardware world, and it is happening. So maybe that's one of the reasons.
Yeah. Well, do you own Fitbit or some other smart bracelet?
Yes, but same problem as with apps. After you wear it for a few weeks, you put it in a drawer, because your habits are not that different from day to day. So you get the information you like, and then afterwards it's just getting a little bit too inconvenient to have it everywhere, because you have to charge it, you have to download the data, whatever. Same with apps. I think it's 95% of the apps are opened only once. It's quite scaring numbers, and it is also happening in the hardware. Very many of these gadgets end up in a drawer, but that's fine. I mean, for me as an investor, you can still make money by selling it maybe only once and having a recurring revenue. In this phase, isn't that important.
So now, of course, we have hardware startup accelerators. Maybe you, Aleksander, can continue. Why do we have the need for specialized startup accelerators for hardware? Why are they different from the software ones? What are the benefits for startups? Why would someone join you and not, I don't know, some famous software accelerator?
I see many people who I also saw during my presentations. I don't want to repeat everything which is said there, but one of the reasons is why Accelerator started was that in order to build a successful business, you need connections, right? In order to build a successful hardware business, you need connection in the hardware world. So if you go to a software accelerator, for example, they don't have a network, because their network is completely different. So that's one of the reasons having a specialized accelerator for the hardware. And maybe Yaroslav has opinion or some other things to add.
Thanks. Actually, the concepts of our accelerator are different from Build It. The main difference that our main business is a new product development. We do the product from idea to the mass production. So we do industrial design and then drawings, then prototypes, production, even sometimes delivery. And we founded Accelerator not just to be investors. Our main aim was to help startups, and in one time we can carry maximum 3 or 4 projects, and we exchange our services for the share in the company. So we are not given a full service of, like, due diligence, whatever. We can advise someone.
Yeah. Jeff, you have Accelerator as well, as I understood.
Yes, that's correct. So Hardware.co is, in addition to the acceleration program, it's also a networking and community events organization. But I can speak as to why we have an accelerator program. We formed in order to help hardware startups as much as possible. So all of the founders sat around a table and said, okay, we have these resources, we want to accomplish this outcome, what's missing? And we found that the stage between very early startups, so I have this idea, I have a prototype, to I'm getting on the store shelves, I'm getting contracts, I'm getting sold, there's a big gulf. And in this gulf is, okay, how do I manufacture stuff? Who do I need to talk to? What's involved in building a product? And so the Hardware.co Accelerator, the Berlin Hardware Accelerator, the program was designed to fill in this gulf as much as possible. As opposed to a software company, there are so many extra things that you need to do when you're doing a hardware company. You need to worry about sourcing, you need to worry about manufacturing, inventory, logistics. You also need to worry about regulatory issues, certifications. And if you're unprepared for it, then it's going to be an early death. And if you don't have the right liquidity at the right point in time, then it's going to be an early death. And there are so many ways that you can kill a hardware company that don't even come into the picture when you're running a software company. And the goal of our accelerator is to inform as much as possible, here are the things you need to do to have a successful company, and also here are the people that you need to know.
Well, Aleš, you learned about that process on a hardware way, but you mentioned today that you are now too smart for hardware accelerators. Can you explain that?
I also said that I don't want this to leak out, so thank you. No. It just 3 years ago when we started off, there were no serious hardware accelerators or incubators or whatever you want to call it. I think that nowadays things has got a bit more mainstream, so you get it. But the problem with hardware is that there are so different phases, right? I had that on my presentation. There is a theory that it takes, before you launch a product, roughly 6 times the time as if you would just launch a product as a software. And this is not simply because it takes longer, it's simply because it has so much more things that you have to do. So there are different phases that you have to address, they have to go through, as Jeff mentioned, from certification and regulation to manufacturing, to producing stuff, designing, dealing with suppliers. Like, no accelerator can prepare you to stuff that we encountered. Like, we got forged electronic components, like sensors, which we discovered only when they were actually in our product. This is just one small detail that you have to be careful about. So yeah, well, we didn't go through it, but for the past 4 years we've been bleeding all over the place, and we obviously still have some stuff left to bleed out. But the idea is that hardware is getting easier to do, primarily because you have access to big markets, right? In my view, you are a hardware startup, even if you do, there is a famous project in Slovenia, they do a wooden camera, right? Basically, they only use wood, handmade wood, to build a camera. It has no electronics, but they are a hardware startup. Their biggest advantage is that if they would do it 10 years ago, they would have to go to a local shop and start selling. You can then go to the neighboring country, neighboring city, and slowly roll it out. The difference with startup is that they can actually, they did a Kickstarter campaign and they roll it out worldwide immediately, right? So with Accelerator, you just have to be careful, right? Not careful, but you have to be selective. Some really concentrate on prototyping, which is great. Some others on supply chain, there are not a lot of them. Some other on the manufacturing process, selling the stuff and all that. So there are really, really different points in time where you're going to Accelerator. And as opposed to a software ones, there is really a lot of sense to actually make 1, 2, or 3 hops in different accelerators if there are different ones.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned manufacturing. Cube Sensor is produced in Slovenia, mainly, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah.
What about that? What about China? What about some third solution?
Okay. People who ask me or who ask me two things: why is our product so expensive, and why we are not producing in China, usually had never tried to do a hardware product, because they have no idea what they're talking about. Number one, price-wise, you price at the point where you can sell. That's very easy. If I'm oversold, and in our case, in our worst time, we had a backlog of 5 months after people actually paid for the product and we were shipping. It was not like pre-orders. We obviously are doing something right in terms of pricing the product. Number two, China and driving down the price. China actually makes sense when you're making 100,000 units or more, right? There are some suppliers for us who actually have minimal order quantities of like 10,000 units. We're a small startup. We have no bargaining power with that. And even on top of that, because we are a startup and we did not have a lot of experience, we had to be there. It's much easier at the factory. It's much easier to bootstrap on gas, if that takes you 15 minutes to a local factory, than on plane tickets if you have to fly to Shenzhen every 3 weeks. Because factories don't know how to do this stuff, because you're building something new. You are a startup, right? You're not just building the next TV set.
Yaroslav, you have something to say about China?
Yes, sure. There are two opinions, you can start locally or you can go to China. But there is also a third one. If you hire someone locally who is skilled in China, that's also an option, because a startup usually has no idea about the hardware, let's say. They don't know how to produce it. But he can apply for the local people who have experience to do the product in China or any other country or locally as well. It can be Accelerator or, let's say, a company specialized in the product development. In that case, you don't need to do everything by yourself. You need to focus on the sales and marketing, which I consider also a very important part of any project, instead of sitting 24 hours at the factory. So that's my opinion. You have to say something?
Yes, I have to say something. The reason why I completely disagree is that if your core business is actually building the stuff, then the only person I would send to China would be my co-founder. You cannot hire your core competence guy. You simply cannot. You have to have it in your core team. If you are a type of startup that you actually sell things, that this is your core competence, you again better should not go into developing stuff. You rather find a no-name product that you package into your branding and sell it if it already exists. But going after something that you have to manufacture and try to hire someone to do it across the board, I think is extremely dangerous.
Jeff, what do you think?
I have to agree that unless you have a very specific case, that going to China from the very beginning is probably a bad idea. For the reasons of what are you doing flying halfway around the world to sleep on the factory floor, to being able to negotiate and figure out how to build your product while you're still figuring out what your product is something that is much easier to do in your own neighborhood, in your own backyard. But also this concept of having a product competency and not something you want to outsource. I'd like to share an anecdote. As part of the Hardware Accelerator, I help from time to time investors sort of do due diligence checks on hardware companies, and I was speaking to the founder of a company. They make a consumer electronics device, and the investor wanted to know, was this a good company to invest in? And so the first place to go always is the team. Okay, who's on your team? Who has the competency for building things? And it's, oh yeah, we got this one guy in China, and we have this whole team building the firmware, and this whole team building the plastics. Is that the team is yours, or you pay them? They're contractors. Oh, they're contractors, but we have an airtight contract, and everything's great, and everything they build is ours. And this is when you sort of just smiling and nod and say, oh, they have no idea. And when you're building a hardware startup, whether it's a consumer product or it's something that gets attached to a service, you really have to be able to put your hands on every part of the process, because every part of the process you're not able to put your hands on is not yours, and it's a risk. And
it's actually exactly the same as with. It's exactly the same as with software. I cannot imagine running a software startup where I would outsource all of my software development. Simply doesn't work.
that's not a software startup.
Yeah. Well, Alex, since we mentioned software is a big part of hardware startup. Can you say what is more important, the hardware part or the software part? Or
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. Also, again, in my presentation, there's new business models emerging which didn't exist before. Hardware companies used to be selling the product, and that was it. So the customer lifetime value was very low. Now there are hybrid business model coming on the market. For example, hardware as a service, in parallel as software as a service, or where hardware is a premium feature. So you get the free product, which is a software mostly, but you get a premium feature which comes through using the hardware. So it's very hard to say. My opinion is that nowadays it's very hard to survive as a hardware company without having a software attached to it, because you need a recurring revenue, and this is something which every investor inspects. So kind of, I guess, the answer would be, even I'm reluctant to say, software is a little bit more important in terms of it's very hard to sell a hardware product without software interface. It's very easy to sell a software product without hardware interface. So I guess software is a bit more important. But again, we just saw on the last presentation a good example. If you combine these two, there's a huge market opportunity.
you agree? Okay. Well, let's say you met a software guy or a girl, and he or she wants to enter the hardware industry. What advice would you give to that person? Where to start? Who are his or her co-founders, mentors, investors? This is a whole brand new world for those people.
Okay, since we're running out of time, I'm suggesting everybody gives one piece of advice, right? So my advice would be, if you're a software background engineer looking to go into the hardware scene, do not start by building hardware. Start by looking something like Alex and Jeff was saying, so something which is a no name, attach your brand to it, and try to make it. You're still a hardware company, in my opinion, even if you don't do your own development.
Yaroslav?
It depends on the situation with this guy, but mainly, on my opinion, everything depends on the person. So if the person capable to do the competences necessary for this project, I mean that he can try to do by himself, then he has different chances. But I'm not a professional in software. It's very hard for me to comment from what to start, from software or hardware. I would say from hardware, but it's not a, professional answer might be.
Well, hardware in itself is just the tools to deliver the final product or user experience, right? If you can buy it off the shelf, obviously you do it. Even with Cube sensors, part of our offering uses Raspberry Pi. That's brilliant. I mean, you buy it for 20 euros or $20 a pop, and you put a software inside of it, right? The part that we couldn't source elsewhere, we built ourselves. So it depends what kind of a problem you're actually addressing, and then try to figure out how you resolve it and what kind of people you actually have to bring in company to build it. Just building hardware on itself, well, try to do something with Legos. It's the easiest way.
Alex touched on this a little bit, but my first advice for somebody who wants to get into building a hardware startup is, as much as possible, don't. And that might sound a little bit strange, but if there's a way that you can deliver your product, your service, without having to develop the hardware that is required for it, that's the way that you should go. So it's nice to have hardware that you've developed in-house, but there's so much involved that if there's any way to avoid it, you should. And the way that I explain this to software people is, imagine that you're going to ship a product, And you're only allowed to compile it 4 times. You can press go 4 times, and each time you press that button, it costs 15,000 euro.
I think that this is the good ending of this panel. We need to wrap things up. We are running out of time, but feel free to share your opinion on social media using hashtag IDCEE 2014. Thank you, guys.